All right, Episode 7 of Europos, an interview with Judith Herrin, historian of Byzantium. It's taken me a while to get this out. The reason why I initially wanted to interview Professor Herrin is because I think Byzantium looms large in the collective imagination of Western Europe. It's kind of a familiar but different image, a version of European Christendom where the relationship between temporal and sacred power, and in which the Greek and pagan and Roman legacy was negotiated in the Christian context differently to how it was in the West. So we get into that. Towards the end, you'll hear that Professor Herrin is a defender of Byzantium. She's very passionate, but her interests are also with the Ostrogoths, with Theodoric the Great. Her latest book, Ravenna, deals with the legacy of Theodoric in Italy. So towards the end of the interview, we get into that as well, which I think is fascinating. Enjoy. Did Byzantine religiosity differ from that of the Latin West as a consequence of understanding the original Greek of the Gospel?
I think this touches on another issue that you also raised in your printed list of questions to discuss, and that is the immediacy of the New Testament stories as they were perceived in Byzantium. The New Testament Greek is fairly simple. It's very direct. The narratives are not difficult to follow. And because they were very quickly represented in scenes that illustrated the miracles and the last week of Christ's holy life, and of course the conception and the whole notion of the role of the Virgin Mary and her virgin birth, or rather her spiritual conception, all that became very clear to people in the East. And I think those who lived in other parts of the world where Christianity was, which arrived in a language that was difficult to understand, lacked that immediacy, that sense of contact and communication and immediate reaction. And of course, if you also add then the fact that the theology was encapsulated in images, which were deeply revered as representations of gospel truth, then you can see how people began to relate very closely to individual figures, saints, particularly, for example, people who were named Stephanos. Obviously, your Saint Stephen is going to be your patron saint, and you're going to have a direct relationship with that saint. And indeed, I think women frequently felt that they had a role to play in their identification with Maria, the Holy Mother. They also experienced motherhood. All these things became very much clearer to them. And therefore, their interest in theology, in whether the Holy Spirit could have descended from heaven in the form of a dove and impregnated the Virgin through the ear, all these things became more real and possible than they were perhaps in other contexts for other peoples. So the notion that one could read, not necessarily that anybody could read, they could see the Gospels illustrated. We're talking about a vast majority of illiterate people, 80% of society. And of course, the 20% is largely male. So here we're dealing primarily with a lot of uneducated women who nonetheless have an identity which they feel can be represented through Christian figures. And I think that's a very significant element in their interest in theology, in their interest in the discussions that took place over the role of icons, over the question of the wording of the creed, over issues which were gobbledygook to people in the Latin West who were similarly uneducated and didn't understand Latin and didn't know what they were signing up for when they converted to Christianity. So there's a much deeper resonance of Christian belief in the East, where this proximity to what's gospel truth is made very clear. And you go to the liturgy, you go to the church on Sundays and feast days. Some go more than others, but nonetheless, the church is a very important focus in the life of villagers and people in the country, not just in cities. And what the priest says is very important as guidance. And you understand, because the liturgy is responsive, that you say hallelujah at this point, or you say amen, and you are part of that communication with the divine. And that is another way in which, because it's in Greek and it's the language of ordinary people, they can participate in a positive way. So there are lots of other things which make it much easier for the people we call the Byzantines to have a very direct sense of access to Christian faith, which they express and then they manifest in their practical lives, teaching their children that they have to be generous, that they have to be loving, that they have to respect their elders, admire their grandparents and their leaders, and go to church and dutifully recite what they understand to be the tenets of Christianity. So that's a very important difference, I think, from the experience of people in other cultures.
Could you outline how ordinary people affected the constitution of canon law by interacting with clerical leadership?
The illustration of that would be the canons that were passed at the council called in Trullo in 692, when the bishops of all the remaining parts of the Byzantine Empire were summoned to Constantinople. And they brought with them issues which hadn't been decided in canon law for many, many years, almost over a century. And these we can see reflect their concerns about what their parishioners were doing and thinking and getting wrong. And much of their anxiety was focused on the advance of Islam, the fact that there were other believers who've claimed to have the sole true revelation from the same God, Allah, through the revelations of Muhammad, which were obviously quite distinct from those of the Christian Gospels. And of course, that the Muslims believed that they had the final revelation in their language and that it superseded all other monotheistic revelations of the Old and the New Testament. And so they were put in a very difficult situation, the bishops, particularly in the areas that had been overrun by the Muslims. How were they to react? Obviously, they were to stay with their Christian communities. They were not to flee unless everybody fled. And I think even in that case, they were very anxious about where they should go and how they should behave. But basically, there was a concern which we can see in issues such as a custom that has developed in some parts of the church, which is that on the day when they celebrate Christ's birth, people, not just women, go to the church and they offer gifts to images of the Virgin Mary to congratulate her on her birth, the birth of her son. This is clearly a maternal thing, but we learn that priests were also involved. And of course, this is not a liturgical celebration, which is actually documented as a proper ritual. And indeed, the fathers, when they get together, the bishops are all together in council, decide that it's incorrect and wrong because the Virgin Mary did not give birth like other mothers, because we know it was a miraculous birth. And nor did she have any pains, which they understood that most women did in childbirth. So this practice was condemned as an unofficial and improper way to celebrate the Virgin and the birth of Christ. But of course, on Christmas, on the day that they did celebrate the birth of Christ, there were very special liturgies which drew attention to her role. So you can see this is an extra ecclesiastical practice that has crept in, And at this point in 692, it's decided this is not a good idea. It's too undocumented. It's not got any basis in fact, and it's against our theology, which understands that the Virgin Mary was a very superior figure, not like any other woman.
In Unrivaled Influence, you discuss the role of women in upholding the religious use of icons. Why women specifically? Why were they drawn to this form of observance?
It is related to the fact that the male hierarchy of the Orthodox Church, of the Eastern Church, leaves no room, no role for women. So women may sweep up the dust and arrange the flowers on the altar. That's the limitation of their activity. In the very early period, we hear of a role for deaconesses, who are the presumably equivalent of male deacons, but their position is specifically directed towards the preparation and organization of female adherents who are going to become Christian through baptism, not teaching them, but organizing them. And so there is a short period when these deaconesses seem to have a real role, but very rapidly it's phased out. And there is a sort of order of widows who are elderly women. By canon law, originally they should be over 60 years old, which makes them very elderly in early medieval times. But later it's reduced. But these are widowed women who devote themselves to the church, and they help priests in doing these mundane things, which are sometimes related to home visits or taking the sacrament to people who are very ill, accompanying the priest and helping the priest. But basically, there is a very clear theological understanding that at the moment where the priest makes the great where he dedicates the wine and the bread, which represent the body and the blood of Christ, he stands in the position of Christ at the Last Supper, and he represents the great leader and hero of Christian thinking, and that role can never be played by a woman, which is why there are no women priests in the Orthodox Church today, although some, I think, argue very persuasively that the recruitment of women into the priesthood and even to the bishoprics of the Anglican Church has been the saving of Anglican Christianity. I mean, it is stronger and it has been enormously expanded by the recruitment of dedicated women. That was not the case in the Orthodox East, and therefore women were effectively excluded from leading roles, from roles of responsibility. And in those circumstances, they sought other ways of expressing their fervor. And this type of religiosity found a resource in the images with which they could converse. And it sounds odd, but of course we do sometimes look at a very impressive image and think about discussing with its subject. And they at the time clearly found it very reassuring and occasionally miraculously revealing to have conversations with figures like Christ, Mary, the angels, and sometimes the favorite saints. And in that way, they could express their anxieties and their religious fervor, and occasionally through dreams and visions, they felt they had responses. And I think that's why for the illiterate and the uneducated, icons became a very useful form of communication with the divine and very, very, very significant in their lives.
What is the pagan legacy in Byzantium?
Knowing about ancient Greek philosophy and having access to the texts, although of course they were written in a rather more difficult Greek than the Greek of the Gospels, meant that teachers who had been involved in instructing mainly young men, but also, as we know from Hypatia, young women when they were very bright and very demanding. They had a sense of philosophy which I think was very real and very important, particularly in the notion of paideia, in education, and the importance of being aware of what the ancients had said about the world, about the creation of the world, about how the world functions, about how the gods intervene in the world. Clearly, there was very little direct influence that I know of the rituals and the scandalous stories of the Olympian gods in the Christian dimension. But the notion of understanding divinity and understanding the character that makes a very worthy person, virtue, honor, excellence in activity, all these elements of ancient Greek philosophy percolated into the Christian notion of virtue and honor. And I think it's mainly through the schools of the educators that this transference can be seen. I've recently been reading the work of Michael Champion, who's worked on the schools of Gaza. Gaza in the 4th to 6th centuries was absolutely one of the liveliest places in the Near East after Alexandria. And it had schools with teachers, some of whom were actually very rooted in their ancient Greek pagan beliefs. Others were already Christian and wished to communicate what they felt was so much of value in ancient thinking to Christian students. And they were rivals, and they competed to attract the best students. And they had very interesting methods of communicating the ancient texts, commenting on them, teaching by having the students read and repeat and then think about what they'd said. All this system of education, most of it oral, very little of it written, was incredibly important in incorporating a lot of ancient philosophical ideas into Christian thinking. And in the schools of Gaza, it's quite clear there was a very distinct influence. And I'm quite sure this happened in many, many other places. We know it happened in Alexandria, where there were different sorts of Christians as well as different sorts of pagans. There were people who felt that the earth was, believed very firmly that the earth was flat. There were others who went along with the spherical earth, and they argued about these matters from their different positions. And most of them, by the 6th century, were Christians, but they still had the same obsessions with the really important issues. And I think that's where we can see how very significant ancient Greek thinking was to the early Christian communities.
Is the theme of Trojan descent by way of Aeneas significant in Byzantium, the way it was for the Holy Roman emperors in the West?
That's a very difficult issue, and I think it's not easy to see that a connection, a direct connection. The biblical authority of figures like Moses, the great prophets, who indeed prophesied the arrival of Jesus and the adoption of Christianity as a replacement of Judaism. This takes place within a certain framework that we believe was very much influenced by the ancient Greek philosophy, but it wasn't so much influenced by Roman thinking. I think the Roman influence comes through the politics and the military activity that made the empire. And that, of course, is something that was way beyond the experience of the biblical communities and the early Jewish cities, or even the ancient Greek city-state. So the notion of empire and the conquest of areas beyond anybody's wildest dreams by the Romans was a way of exercising political authority. And that the genius, if you like, is that Constantine the First, the Great, in the early 4th century, having won his great political battle by defeating all his enemies, becoming master not only of Rome, but building New Rome in Constantinople, which really was the sort of acme of achievement of the Roman Empire in a way. He then decided, I think on not very much on religious grounds, that it was necessary to incorporate the Christians. And at that point, he started patronizing the church building, patronizing the bishops, getting them to come together to solve their problems, organizing them into a church. And I think that was a very important political step which married the Roman notion of empire to the idea of an established church. And it brought the Roman history of conquest and military supremacy and all the other very important elements of Roman achievement. Let's not forget legal decisions, very carefully argued, to be fair, to give rights where rights are due, the notion of architectural and engineering skills. I mean, it's not every community that can build the Pont du Gard and carry the water across the top of the Great Bridge. These types of skills became part of imperial wisdom and passed then into the notion of a Christian empire, in which emperor and patriarch or archbishop were to cooperate. And that, I think, is the way in which the Roman notions became part of what we call the Byzantine world. But it's a slow business, and it doesn't seem to me to have very much connection with Aeneas as the founder of Rome and the Romulus and Remus story, and the connection to the Trojan War, which was known to the Greeks, of course, as the Trojan War, not Aeneas going off to found Rome in the West. And because Homer was so absolutely critical to the whole notion of Greek identity, to the understanding of Greek history, and to the admiration for Homeric verse, which meant that it was still the text that young men had to learn first. So, and that's another thing which is so peculiar, because of course it's very, very different Greek from what you would have heard spoken in the 6th century AD. But that's where you had to begin, because that's where all the stories of our history, of our antiquity, were based.
We often hear that in Byzantium, Greek identity was obviated and its people simply understood themselves as Roman. That's probably too strongly put, but how would you characterize the self-understanding of Byzantines?
Well, you raise this very, very difficult question, which is endlessly debated now that the issue of identity is very, very current and very difficult. Because they call themselves Romans, Romei, it's quite clear that they identified themselves with the Roman Empire, with the culture of empire, with the notion that their empire had supplanted the empire of Rome, continued it and extended it and Hellenized it by using Greek as its base language, although of course Latin persisted for quite some time, well into the 6th century, and Latin was still important as a language of communication with other Western areas. So it's a very, very difficult thing to say at what point the notion of having access to the Greek history of the ancients and not just the Homeric myths, but all the medical texts, all the historical texts, all the other poetry, all the technical wizardry of mathematics, which had been written down in Greek and was available to those people who could read it and could elaborate and use it. that was part of the educational system in the empire that in which people lived calling themselves Romans in Greek. That's a real concatenation of different identities put into one form. And I think we have to recognize that people living under Byzantine rule probably had multiple identities, because in addition to their knowledge of, if they had any knowledge of ancient Greek, plus their local Greek and their own regional customs, whether they were agricultural, whether they were spiritual, whether they had very particular legends and important defining characters, because all these regions were very different. I mean, the regions that made up the Byzantine Empire were very, very varied. So people living in Egypt, in Upper Egypt, for example, couldn't possibly have had the same identity as the people living in the Balkans, but they both felt themselves to be part of the empire ruled from Constantinople. So multiple identities, and we can see that sometimes the Greek was more prominent, but the ancient Greek, to the extent that it was connected with the pagan gods, was very severely repressed by the church. And it was considered very improper to have any veneration for any of the old gods or goddesses, and certainly not to be offering them wine or meat or making any sort of sacrifice. That was very, very firmly forbidden. And indeed, pagan practice, where it was discovered, whether it was truly pagan practice or not, was very severely repressed. So there was a very definite move to take all that danger away from Christians who were to believe in the correct way and were given a much stricter and clearer code of conduct. But as I say, it had in its turn adopted many of the philosophical concepts of the ancient Greeks and of the pagan Romans. That's clear, that because the Romans had accepted the Greek Olympian gods and transformed them to Latin forms with new names and so on, there were other cults which were familiar to the mainly to the soldiers who traveled with the Byzantine army and learned about other beliefs and other types of veneration. I'm not getting very far with this question of identity because it is so vexed. And I think there are many, many new projects on it, mainly the school in Vienna under Walter Pohl, which has produced the most wide-ranging approaches to the problem. And there's a lot to discover. And we're still finding our way through a very dense forest of ideas.
Why did the devaluation of the gold standard during the 11th century, due to the introduction of silver alloys under Constantine IX, result in the rise of a more feudal system in Byzantium, assuming the two are connected? And what had the empire looked like previously?
The devaluation of the gold numisma in the 11th century is still very mysterious, but I think it's been shown quite clearly by Kostas Kaplanis that there was a need to provide pay for the army that had to go and fight against the Pechenegs in the Balkans, and that at that point the gold was adulterated with silver. And after that point, those people who were aware that it wasn't of the highest carat would demand gold of the good old days of Basil II. And they knew that there'd been a change, and they didn't want to be paid, they didn't want to use this debased coinage. So there is a reason why it had to happen, but it was a very grave step down from the imperial high point of sustaining a gold currency of the same value for what's over 700 years. It's amazing when you consider what vicissitudes the empire had been through, how many economic crises, how many terrible problems had occurred, loss of territory and wars and so on. So the decision to devalue was a step away from an imperial control. And I suspect that through that loss of control and the dissatisfaction with the devalued gold that then circulated, people began to question the authority of the emperor. Why is it that the emperor no longer provides an utterly reliable gold? And have we got a coin here? We're in the middle of the 12th century, and there's been another slight devaluation. Is this coin as valuable? Will it buy the same amount? Is it reliable? Why are we being fobbed off with this coinage which is not as it should be? That inspires mistrust, doubt, anxiety, and I think it helps to explain the fragmentation of peripheral regions of the empire, which we see beginning in the 12th century and which becomes stronger towards the end of the 12th century when Cyprus declares independence. And that's not the Cypriots, it's their leader who wants to set himself up as a mini emperor in Cyprus. But of course, it does mean that there has to be a campaign against that rebellion. And when it's unsuccessful, Cyprus becomes a separate unit. And it's the same in the city of Trebizond, which decides that it wishes to assert its own imperial role and elects a relative of the ruling Komnenos dynasty as its own emperor. And you see also in areas of southern Greece where there are many rebels who simply think now is the time to exert a stronger control over the areas which we feel are already within our range of authority. So there is some underlying destruction of imperial unity, which has been going on slowly through that period. And it takes decades and decades to take a political form and become an outright rebellion. But then when it does, undoubtedly, the debased currency is one of the reasons and one of the motives for that type of rebelliousness.
And that same trajectory is actually driven forward, I suppose, by 1204, the Fourth Crusade, the Frankish occupation, and this idea that you can set up miniature Byzantiums to keep apart from the invading authority that's been set up in the capital.
Yes, clearly. Once the capital has been overrun by Westerners who've set up their own emperor, it's fair play for anybody else to be the empire in exile. And of course, the emperor goes to Nicaea in Western Asia Minor, where there is the court, and eventually the patriarch also arrives. But at the same time, Trebizond has been declared independent and has its own emperor, and other Komnenos Doukas in Epirus decides he would like to be emperor. And in Thessaloniki, there's a definite sense of separation from Constantinople because they don't want to be ruled by Latins from the West. So in many areas, there are really quite significant moves to separate from the capital. And it's not until 1261, when Michael VIII regains Constantinople, that there can be any sense of converging back into a post-1204 imperial situation. And of course, this is nonetheless, it's never as strong as it had been before.
Did the idea of reuniting with the West survive Justinian's attempt to incorporate Italy in any meaningful way? Maybe the Fourth Crusade shattered any sense of kinship with the West?
In the new book on Ravenna, of course, I'm very much concerned with this problem, which has been endlessly debated. And of course, there are historians who believe that there was a whole ideology of reconquest and reintegration of the Western provinces, all the Western provinces of the Roman Empire, under Constantinopolitan control. I don't see it that way, but I do think that the surprisingly rapid success in over the Vandals in Africa, which does seem to have been sparked very much by refugees from the Arian Christian persecution organized by the Vandal kings against the Catholic bishops of Africa. That was a very great motive for Justinian sending what was a rather small expeditionary force. But Belisarius was very fortunate and very brilliant, and he managed to not only capture the city of Carthage, the capital, but also the Vandal king, Calimer, and returned to Constantinople, with goods, with trophies, with spoils, and there in a parade, a great parade through the Hippodrome, everybody could witness his triumph and the defeat of an enemy. But I think it was the trust that Justinian had placed in Amalasuintha, the daughter of Theodoric the Goth, she who was his only child and who ruled in Ravenna as best she could. It was her murder by her cousin Theodahad that provoked another stage in campaigning in the West, in which Belisarius was sent back to take possession of Sicily and work his way up Italy to regain Rome and the treasure of Theodoric, which was reputed to be one of these great collections of gold and massed objects of great value, which was kept in the treasury in Ravenna. And one of the aims of these great campaigns was always treasure, loot and treasure, not just the spoils of war, which you stripped off your defeated warriors, their weapons, their armor, anything that they wore that was valuable, but it was also to gain wealth, to gain actual resources, in addition to the land that you would conquer. So this was a reason for, or he used the murder of Amalasuintha as an excuse to send Belisarius back to Italy, but he did not go directly to Ravenna. He had to protect his rear, so he first had to take Sicily. That was not too difficult. But then Italy, southern Italy, proved to be not a walkover. And at that point, the account of Procopius, which is very detailed, and he was an eyewitness of it, is very, very interesting, as he points out that communities that were loyal, that remained loyal to the Gothic kingdom of Theodoric, his daughter, and even the murderer Theodahad. These were people who'd been in control in Italy and had brought peace and had brought prosperity and were considered good administrators, good rulers, and people were loyal to them. And they resisted these foreigners coming in, these Greeks coming in from the east. In Naples, the Jewish community sided with the Goths, and they fought valiantly, but they realized that they were outnumbered, and eventually a truce was arranged. So cities fell slowly, and although Rome welcomed the imperial troops, and the Bishop of Rome must have been relieved to have Catholic, that is to say, non-Arian Christians coming to his relief, it really was Ravenna, the seat, the capital of the Gothic kingdom, that was the aim of that campaign. And in 540, Belisarius entered the city and effectively took over the kingdom and obtained the treasure, which was taken back to Constantinople. So there was a point to that campaign which ended in 540, and to the immense surprise of the authorities in Constantinople, the Goths revived. They elected another leader. They started fighting all over again, and they regained Rome, and they regained vast amounts of territory, but they never got back to Ravenna. They never recaptured their capital. So although the war continued for a miserable decade beyond 540, terrible period of destruction, Ravenna remained under the imperial control of Constantinople, and it was to remain that way until 751. So it was the key city that had to be taken. And when Belisarius achieved his conquest, that was in a sense the end of his period of the campaign. And I don't think Justinian ever conceived of a notion of recapturing all of the Western provinces of the Roman Empire. His aim was to re-establish control in Italy, specifically over the Ostrogothic kingdom that had been rebellious, centered on Ravenna, and to reassert control over Sicily and Rome, which, like North Africa, Sicily and North Africa were also very, very productive areas. Wheat growing, full of wine, making pottery, all sorts of very important commercial activity that was very important to the empire. So very useful to have regained control over these rich provinces in the West, but no notion of reasserting a Western Roman Empire. This was always to be outposts of imperial control from Constantinople in the West.
What was the political role of Arianism? What was its effect on Theodoric the Great's decisions, his style of rulership, if any?
Oh, I think it's very much a question of his own identity as a Goth. The Goths had been converted to Christianity in the mid-4th century by Ulfilas, who had translated the Gospels into Gothic. So they had their own Bible in their own language, and they had their own liturgy and their own priests. And of course, that notion that they were not true Christians was totally absent. They were converted to Christianity, and it was the Arian form of Christianity that was in favor in Constantinople when Ulfilas arrived there under Constantius II. So the Goths justifiably thought that they had achieved Christian status in the correct way, and that their beliefs were correct, and their theology was in every way perfect. And there was absolutely no need for them to pay further attention to theological differences. So they had an identity which was quite specifically connected with that moment of conversion, and they remained wedded to it because it was their Gothic notion of how to be a Christian. And Theodoric could not possibly have given up his own perception of religion and his own definition of Christianity for a Catholic one, because that would have meant adopting the definitions of his enemies, the people that he had to conquer in Italy, who were by and large Catholic Christians, called themselves. But both sides called themselves Orthodox. Of course, they had very firm ideas about their own orthodoxy. But the Goths were always a minority in Italy. We don't know how many people arrived with Theodoric in the late 5th century, but undoubtedly they were a tiny proportion of the population that he then conquered and ruled. And the bishops in the cities in Italy were by and large all Catholic Christians, not Arians. And therefore his Arian Christian hierarchy had to establish its own presence and its own loyalty, and generate the loyalty that it deserved through the Gothic population, through buildings, through wonderful Church of Sant'Apollinare Nuovo and the baptistry attached, which are really magnificent buildings, very beautifully decorated in mosaic. And Theodoric was very determined to give his church the same status and the same high standing as the Catholic bishops. But he also gave the Catholic bishops the tolerant permission to carry on building, to carry on with all their rituals, to do their own liturgy, to generate their own forms of conversion, and to sustain their own beliefs. And he offered the same tolerance to the Jews, so that the Jewish communities in Ravenna and other cities in Italy were allowed to rebuild their synagogues if they were attacked, though not to expand them. So a very distinct notion of toleration, which Theodoric, in the words of Cassiodorus, his pen pusher, his writer, made very clear when he said, I don't approve of your beliefs, but I cannot prevent you from believing them. So there's a real tolerance, partly because he knew he represented a minority and a minority belief, but also because it was very much better to have good relations with all the other religions represented in Italy than to be fighting them all. So there's a sort of political element to Theodoric's determination to sustain Arian Christianity, but it was also very, very deeply linked to his Gothic identity. And even as somebody who tried to be like an emperor, to rule like an emperor, to be as grand as an emperor, he retained the title king, and he said he was always acting under the authority of the emperor in Constantinople.
Do you think the term Dark Ages does more to hide than to describe things? In your most recent work, you highlight the research and innovation that was being carried out in Ravenna, for example.
Yes. Yes. No, I think we have to stop talking about the Dark Ages. The darkness is because we do not see what was going on. And there was a lot going on. And there were a lot of very educated people in the West, in the medieval West, in the period after the so-called fall of the Roman Empire in the 5th and 6th, and even into the 7th centuries. There were many educated people who cherished their learning, who taught others, who transmitted fragments of what had been such a vital part of ancient imperial education. But in Ravenna, we see it much, much more clearly, because we know from manuscripts that there was a medical school, there were medical schools, one Greek, one Latin, that the Greek school taught Galen in translation and Hippocrates, that there were teachers who had been to Alexandria who knew about how Greek medical traditions had been passed on, elaborated, and improved over the centuries. So Hippocrates and Galen were really alive in Ravenna. And the doctor that was responsible for doing this teaching, we learn, was called Agnellus, like many other people in Ravenna. And Dr. Agnellus gave lectures on the basic introduction to medical investigations as laid down by Galen. And people say, well, this was all very elementary, but Galen was not taught in other centers, and medical knowledge did disappear in most parts of the West. So Ravenna stands out as one of those key points where this knowledge was kept alive, was commented on, was taught, and in a manuscript, we learned that a student called Simplicius, who also calls himself a doctor, medicus, made notes. And he said, I heard him talk about these things. So we can gradually begin to realize how important Ravenna was in the maintenance of medical knowledge. Then we have another example in the most extraordinary scholar, not known by name, who was asked by his brother Odo to write an account of the history of the world, how it came into existence. And he's known as the cosmographer, the anonymous cosmographer of Ravenna. But what he wrote was extraordinarily interesting and shows that he was very familiar with ancient Greek geographies, with ancient Greek place names, with the Roman administration of provinces and cities, with the names of rivers, with the way people had traveled from one place to another. And so that's another instance of how important it was in Ravenna in the 7th and early 8th centuries that there were resources that made it possible for somebody to write such a book. And certainly, although we don't have any copies that are earlier than the 13th century, which shows that there were many, many centuries in which this text was copied and copied and copied. But in the year 1112, one Guido of Pisa knew the text, copied it all into his own account of the geography of the world. And so it is preserved in a 12th century text under a different name, which is a very curious and common way in which texts were incorporated by later readers. They didn't say, oh, this is an interesting text, but I don't know who wrote it. And therefore, well, they did. They said, this is a very interesting text. I don't know who wrote it. It doesn't have a title at the beginning. It doesn't have an attribution at the end. There's no colophon saying who copied this manuscript. I will just take this text and put it into my geography. And we can see it very clearly. It is the same text, and sometimes the readings are better in the 12th century than later. But it is very curious evidence of the circulation of texts long after we have any track of them. So Ravenna was a hot point, a very important center of intellectual achievement and respect for scholarship. And it must have had libraries. There must have been collections of books, perhaps owned by the maintained by the governor who came from Constantinople on a regular basis, bringing texts, or by the archbishops who had their own libraries and their own scribes and copyists, or by interested persons who, like Agnellus the historian, knew about the texts that had survived in the municipal archive, where there were lots of documents, legal documents mainly, that he could cite. And he knew of imperial rescripts that had found their way into the municipal archive in Ravenna, and he cites them in his 9th century history of the bishops of Ravenna. So clearly there were scholars and there were interested people who had access to mainly Latin, but also Greek texts, and in fact, even Gothic texts, because the Gothic Bibles that were produced in Ravenna in the 6th century, which are very magnificent, must be only the top, most elite, most extravagant of many, many gospel books that were circulated for the use of Arian Christians using Gothic as their language, as their liturgical language. So gradually these things are coming to light. And it's very interesting that many reused manuscripts, palimpsests, manuscripts where the original writing has been scraped off and washed away, and then the manuscript, the parchment has been reused. And the undertext can be brought up, can be highlighted by modern technical ultraviolet and infrared methods to enable the undertext to be read. And as often as not, sometimes these medieval texts in Latin are written on top of Gothic texts. And through the tracing of these Gothic palimpsests, we're getting a notion of a much broader range of documentation coming out of Ravenna.
How much of the Gothic language do we have in Italy? How much was documented and how much of that survived?
Well, some of the people who sign the legal documents that are still in the municipal archive, that were kept in the municipal archive, signed their signatures in Gothic. There was a Gothic community of priests running a church who were clearly in very great difficulty in the 560s when Justinian ordered that all the Arian churches were to be handed over to the Catholics, and therefore their prosperity, their properties and their actual buildings were taken away from them. And at that point, the use of Gothic and the existence of Gothic priests using the liturgy, performing it in their churches, must have been very, very severely curtailed. And although some sign in Gothic, and there are these texts written in Gothic in the 6th century, beyond that, the language faded away. And it's the same story in Spain, when the Visigoths finally abandoned Arian Christianity and gave up their Gothic liturgy. The liturgical books were collected and burned by order of King Recared, who converted to Catholic Christianity. And at that point, the use of the Gothic texts came to an end. But there was a very determined auto da fe, so that the texts were actually brought to a bonfire and burned. And that meant that vast numbers of commentaries on the Gospels in Gothic all disappeared in the flames. And it's the same problem in Ravenna, except that we don't hear about burning. We just know that the manuscripts were re-scraped and reused, and so we're only finding them as the study of these palimpsests becomes more possible. But it is continuing. And just recently in Bologna, in the library in Bologna, they discovered a new undertext, which has a new Gothic word that was not known before, and it's the Gothic for lion. They didn't know how the Goths translated lion. And it's been found in a context where that is what it must mean. So it's another word to add to the Gothic dictionary.
Given the impact of language, even differences between Greek and Latin on theology and the way terms like logos are understood, it's interesting to think how much of Arianism might have found an anchoring in the Gothic language specifically.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes, most definitely. But from what I've read about the commentaries, there are fragmentary commentaries in Gothic on the Gothic Bible where these issues are discussed and debated. And the notion of how words like logos and Sophia are translated and understood is considered. So there was a real engagement with the theology. It wasn't just an acceptance of a blank check of this is how it has to be. They were constantly investigating and improving their understanding of it. So it was not a non-theological culture.
Okay, last question. Why, in your opinion, has there been a tradition of viewing Byzantium negatively in the West? Is it a question of secular historians inheriting religious prejudices against Eastern Orthodoxy?
Yes, I'm afraid that is true. I think there's a lot to be said for the way in which the Byzantines presented themselves. They lived, their court was a court of incredible color and drama and ritual, in which the emperor sat on a gilded throne with all these magnificent decorations, and the halls were so grand, everything was so sumptuous and colorful. And the emperor his throne could be raised up in the air, and the golden birds could sing in the trees. And all that was designed to impress, and it did, right through the period of the 9th, 10th, up to the 12th century. Visitors said, we can't believe this court. We go to Hagia Sophia, we can't believe the church. We think we are in heaven. These impressive monuments and the way in which the culture was portrayed gave the impression of a richness and an extraordinary degree of sophistication, which was not understood, and of which people were jealous. And I think it is quite clear that the Western visitors to Byzantium wanted to conquer Constantinople because it was so wealthy, because it was such a rich city, because it was so magnificent. And that was a sign for the Fourth Crusade, which succeeded in a way that actually destroyed the central city, the center of the empire. The notion that Byzantium was always characterized by this very grand, sumptuous, and effeminate type of civilization, partly to do with the use of silk. For many, many centuries, silk was a mysterious, unknown quality in the West because the mystery of the silkworm and the mulberry tree had not been imported. But in Byzantium, it was very well controlled. It was an imperial monopoly, and these beautiful silks were sent as gifts, and they were part of the mystery of the voluptuousness. And then there was the fact that the men in the court wore long robes, very colorful, very beautiful, very wonderfully decorated. And the women too, because we see them in the imperial panels in San Vitale. Empress Theodora's ladies-in-waiting wear the most fabulous silk costumes, and fragments of silk with precisely the same little patterns of little red ducks on a green background with gold stripes. All that really colorful culture is documented in material terms. So there was an extraordinary jealousy about the quality of life that these people enjoyed, and Westerners were at pains to condemn it, partly because it was so rich and unobtainable, but also because they felt it generated this effeminate, unfamiliar, unmilitary, unmasculine, warlike activity. Of course, there were generals who then went out to fight, and the Byzantines could fight as well as anyone. But nonetheless, in terms of culture, what characterized Byzantium was this notion of extreme wealth, lots of gold, lots of jewels, endless exotic spices, exotic food, exotic animals. They had tame elephants, they had giraffes, and they were altogether things that were unobtainable in the West. And that notion led to a lot of anxiety, which found a way to accommodate the jealous notion with a condemnation of Byzantium as everything that was duplicitous, cunning, scheming, not direct, use of diplomats and diplomacy and gifts instead of fighting and so on. I think there's a historical basis for this projection of Byzantium, but unfortunately it's given the whole culture a very bad name. And every time I see the word Byzantine incorrectly used in the newspapers, which is frequent, I have to say, I have to write another letter saying this is an incorrect use of the term. But it's an uphill battle.
Sure. And to the point that we have the expression of a Byzantine conversation or Byzantine debate as designating something fruitless, some speculation, how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, the gender of angels, that kind of thing.
No, that was Thomas Aquinas, who wrote in Latin. So he was also very much into detail. But undoubtedly, that was partly a result of the confrontation of Aquinas and his methodology, which was so very, very sophisticated for the time, with the notions of Eastern Orthodox theology, because the Christian communities were then in rival battle, and the whole notion of a council to reunite the churches was part of Aquinas's reason for distinguishing what was specific about Western theology, which the East had to sign up to if there was going to be any cooperation.
I see. Okay, no more questions. Thank you so much for agreeing to speak with me. I really appreciate it.
And thank you for inviting me. It's been very provocative and helpful, and I'm always pleased to discuss Byzantium. It is my passion.